Good morning, everyone. My name is Tetiana Nyzhnyk, and welcome to the Ukrainian-American Concordia University. Today, I'm going to talk about business writing in English. If you have any questions, please use the chat or address them to me via the email address, which you can see on the screens now. Now, let's get started. I've split this webinar or masterclass into two parts. I will start with some fundamentals of business writing, and the second part will be a quiz. While the fundamentals are the key principles which are applicable to, well, most documents which people read and write when they do business and when they make money, then the second part, the quiz, is dedicated to emails and letters only. Now, let's start. I've chosen several types of documents just to demonstrate how different business writing is from what you actually, the types of documents that you read and create every day. Now, on the left, you can now see 7 phrases: annual report, contract, order form, invoice, agenda, minutes, and memo. On the right, there are the definitions. You can try to complete the exercise yourself and to match the words, the types of documents, to the definitions. But I will actually help you with this. Now, let me use the arrows to make them more visible. Now, an annual report. Annual means yearly. Is a document which tells you about the company's performance over the year. It's a huge file with a lot of information, including the accounts for the year. Definitely, there will be other types of reports, but this one is very specific and quite typical. Now, a contract is an agreement. So obviously, it's a legal agreement between two parties or several parties, depending on the type of this particular agreement. Now, there is only one document here, which is actually a form. A form is something which has got pre-printed information, which is already there. You will just have to insert the data or the details that are important. Now, this particular form is an order form. And as soon as I've already given you a hint, this is a paper which you fill in when you want to buy something from a company. Now, an invoice is something which the company will send you after you have completed an order form. Now, this is a paper which will tell you, or which tells you how much you must pay when you buy something from this company. Now, agenda and minutes are associated with business meetings, one very specific type of professional communication skills in business. Now, an agenda is a list of things to discuss at a meeting. And minutes are a written record of what has actually happened at the meeting. So, right here, it is defined as a report of a meeting. And finally, a memo or a memorandum in full is an internal message, in most cases from one person to a group of people. Internal means that this is the communication which happens inside the company. Now, you don't see a letter or an email there, and of course there will be lots of other types of documents and types of writing that people create at work, and which are part of their professional activity. Now, as soon as they are different in format and as soon as they have different purposes, probably the main requirements to such documents will differ as well. We will concentrate on the fundamentals of writing in business and the principles which will help you to create an effective or efficient business document. Now, let's move on to the fundamentals. Now, before I actually starts enumerating what I consider to be important principles of business writing. Now, if you Google for the fundamentals of writing or principles of writing in the business context, you will have lots of different sets of tips and advice, starting with keep it short and simple, and finishing with a list of 20 different peculiarities. Now, I've chosen the most typical 10, or the 10 most typical things to talk about. Now, let's start with number 1. First of all, whatever you write has to be complete. Complete means full. And as I talk, I will also show on the screen the explanation to help you follow what I'm trying to say. Now, a message which is full will contain the information which is necessary or which is pertinent to this particular message. The message that you need the people to transmit, to remember, to understand, like the date, time, location, purpose, and the people who are involved. This is when, where, why, who, and how. So all of those details help the reader understand what exactly you want them to do and what exactly is going to happen. The second fundamental principle of business writing will be conciseness. Concise means brief, short, or laconic. Now, let's assume that the person who is the reader of your document doesn't have the whole day to try to understand what you want him or her to do. So, if your writing is concise, this way you will show the reader that you value the time of them as business professionals. So what you can do here is to check the piece of writing that you have created and get rid of everything which is not necessary, of everything which can be considered a stop phrase, so something which is obvious and which doesn't transmit the essential information. In addition to this one, you should always watch out for long sentences and try to limit the length of sentences and paragraphs. So actually, the shorter, the better. But definitely you have to keep in mind that short doesn't mean that you will have to get rid of the essential information that has to be in the document. Otherwise, you will violate the first principle. Now, the best way to shorten the text is, after you have created the document, revise it and edit it and eliminate everything which you consider not relevant. Now let's continue. The third thing, or the third principle, which is usually mentioned when people talk about effective business writing, is staying clear, clarity. The document has to be readable from the first sight. In general, business writing has to be fronted and reader-friendly. That is, your reader doesn't have to doubt about what you actually meant. Then the reader has to be absolutely clear concerning the action that they have to take. So, starting with the purpose and finishing with the feedback that you expect from the reader, you have to stay crystal clear. Another key point that has to be mentioned here is to keep jargon to a minimum, which means that you will have to use the vocabulary which is understandable. Usually this means that you don't have to use abbreviations and technical terms that might be not familiar to the reader. Another way to achieve clarity in a document is to organize the ideas in a logical manner. Now, the fourth fundamental principle will be accuracy. Accurate does not mean neat. Well, of course, it's always nice when what you've created is pleasant to look at. But here, accurate means correct. And correctness or accuracy works on several levels here. It's obvious that there have to be no typos, no misspellings in the document. The other side of accuracy is no factual errors. That is, you have to be as attentive to detail as possible. Proofreading helps. And sometimes you'll have to ask someone to look through the document because there can be a typo there which you just haven't noticed. Check everything and double check everything, especially the names, the titles, and the numbers, the dates. So everything which is important in your message. Then another point to mention here will be the vocabulary which you choose and the appropriate format for this particular type of document. Well, there is a lot to talk about here, but we will move on to point number 5, which is coherence. Coherent means organized in a logical way. So whatever you create, whatever type of business document you are creating, you have to set your thoughts and ideas in a logical manner. This way, you will help your reader follow along. Coherence is impossible without cohesion. Cohesion means linking the ideas together. One way to do it by using sequence markers, showing that this part of the document is over, and now you're moving on to a new idea. So, always ensure that the overall organization of your document follows a logical development from beginning to the end. Now, let's move on to the 6th principle of good business writing. Whatever you write in the business setting has to be considerate. Now, this is quite a complicated idea here, but as soon as you start reading the explanation, you will see that it only means that your document has to be easy to read and scan. So now we're talking about readability, which is achieved through visual organization, the format and the layout of a document. Different documents, different formats. Requirements to layouts, of course, will vary from document to document, but actually, there are types of documents that are easily recognizable from the first glance or at the first glance. Now, how can you do it? Split the information into paragraphs, one idea per paragraph to be concise. Then you can use headings and subheadings to help the reader see the different parts of the text. If a document is big, for example, if it is a report, then probably you will need a title page, a content page, and separate sections for the main body, for the summary, and for the conclusion. And the supplements if relevant. Then the fonts have to be readable again and easy to see. The fonts and the types of fonts that you use, for example, for a PowerPoint slide, will be different for the generally required fonts in a report. Well, the standard font is Times New Roman 12 or Arial 10. Well, for most business documents that are written nowadays. However, companies might have their corporate requirements for the type of font that they use. Now, bulleted list, the marked list, like the one which I have in this particular slide, will also help to visualize the important information and the list of information. Now, Other types of visualization that you might use to make your text more readable and more digestible will be bold font, italics. Well, the color is actually not applicable to, well, the majority of business documents, unless this is a magazine or a catalog or a brochure. Well, a lot depends upon the intended reader of a document, but in most cases, you have to be consistent. To stay consistent means that if you have chosen one particular type of font, you have to stick to it throughout the whole document. Another extreme will be using too much visualization, which might seem unprofessional. So be careful and try to keep reasonable balance. Now let's move on to point number 7, which is courtesy or politeness. Now, this principle realizes itself on several levels. Always put the reader first, that is, visualize the reader who's going to look through the document, and try to show as much respect to him as possible, or to her as possible. You have to be sincere, you have to be positive, you have to use polite formulas, but of course not too many of those. You have to be very careful with the vocabulary and the language you use. For example, the imperative structures. And one point to keep in mind, which is very important, is to choose the right level of formality for a particular situation. An example is, if you are writing an application letter, and even if you know the name of the recruiter who's going to read your letter, do not start your letter with "Dear John," even if you are sure that his name was John. Address the letter to "Dear Recruiter" or to "Dear Mr. Peterson." Now, the next principle that I've decided to mention is being conversational. It's not that difficult. I already mentioned that you have to visualize the reader when you are writing something. Then pretend that you are talking to someone face to face. One person or a group of people. This will help you stay friendly but professional at the same time. Again, the tone has to be warm, you have to keep positive, and you have to remember that you are talking to a human being. Sometimes, in certain types of documents, it can be advisable to avoid monotony by varying sentence length, for example, and trying to vary vocabulary, again, within the allowed limits. Let's move on to point 9, and the 9th fundamental is credibility. Effective business writing relies on facts, not on your personal opinions. So you have to check your facts, verify the sources that you've used, and make sure that the information and that the data that you have included in the document is up to date, is current. Finally, business writing is specific. Specific is the opposite of vague. Well, another synonym for specific will be concrete. That is, business writing depends on concrete numbers, concrete dates, and concrete timescales, which actually brings you to the first fundamental principle, which was about, well, fullness or completeness of the message. For example, if you want something to be done, then mention the name of the person who has to do it, the date or the deadline, the place, the venue, and whatever else you think is pertinent for the situation. And that's actually almost everything I wanted to cover within this webinar. let me just make several final remarks. I've mentioned several times that business writing has to be reader-friendly. That is, always think about your reader. Visualize your reader trying to look through your message. Is it clear? Does it contain the important information? Well, does the reader have to guess what you actually meant by this word? Have you used any abbreviations which are not clear? Are you polite enough in this particular situation? So always remember about your reader and respect your reader. Next, business writing relies on the standard. Many documents are standardized, starting with the standard format and layout and finishing with the standard wording. Sometimes they help reduce the writing time. That is, you can use a cliche. One example for those will be, for example, writing letters of complaint. So you will use a standard formula to greet the reader, then a standard formula to close the letter, then standard formulas to actually complain. So these help a lot, especially if your level of English is not high enough to be able to formulate something which will be grammatically correct and which will be acceptable for this particular document yourselves. Well, sometimes people say that using cliches is not very good, but sometimes cliches are inevitable. Now, one more important thing that I wanted to mention is being consistent. I did talk about consistency, well, when I mentioned the the standard fonts, for example. But again, I would like to remind you once again that you have to stay consistent. If you have chosen to put a dot after MR, then do it throughout the whole document. If you're using Times New Roman 12, then it has to be Times New Roman 12. You can make it bigger, for example, in headings or subheadings, but still, this is the type of font that you have to stick to throughout the whole document. Another piece of advice will be to try to stay and try to be professional. I know that it might be difficult when you are still studying, but try to be a perfectionist. Show attention to detail. Be very careful with word choice. Everything starts with planning and finishes with revision. That is, when you are done with the document and when you think that everything is perfect, revise it, edit it, and proofread it again. If your level of English is lower than B2, then it's probably a good idea to ask someone else to proofread the document for you. Good English is a must. It's very difficult to create a perfect text when you're not able to exteriorize your ideas freely in writing. The higher level of English you have, the more opportunities you have to rephrase the text, to vary the tone, and to avoid monotony in the use of vocabulary. That is, study as much as possible and use all opportunities and all possibilities to improve your level of English. And finally, practice. Practice as much as possible, because skill comes with practice. Practice will make perfect when it comes to business writing. Even the hardest types of documents, the most complicated ones, will become easy when you have written 3, 5, 10, 20, or 50. Now, this is the end of the theoretical part. Now, if there are any questions, please write a quick email to me and I will try to answer them. Now let's move on to the quiz. The quiz is short. There are only 9 questions on the quiz. Now, I will answer the questions myself, but if you know the answer, please write it in the chat. Question 1. Is the statement true or false? The abbreviation CC in a letter or an email stands for correct carbons. You might have seen this abbreviation in the second line of the address of your email, like to, then CC, then BCC. So this statement is false because correct carbons is not actually the abbreviated phrase. CC stands for carbon copy. You usually use, well, you can, if you see this phrase on a letter or in an email, this means that in addition to the actual recipient of a letter, there will be people who will receive copies. You might have noticed the BCC line in a standard email, which means blind carbon copy. Google the meaning of the phrase, but actually, if you are a BCC addressee, this means that no one else will see your name and address except yourself and the sender. Question 2. Again, is the statement true or false? In the UK, the abbreviated date 2.6.21 on a letter, or actually in any document, will mean the 6th of February, 2021. False, because in the UK, it's not February, it's June, which is the 6th month of the year, and the day is the 2nd of June, 2021, because the order in which the day, month, and the year, the date actually appears, differs. In the United Kingdom and in Europe, this is in British English, you start with the day, then you mention the month, and then you state the year. There will be variations, like they don't usually stick to only one type of format. Like you can use, you can write the day with TH, without TH. Sometimes the day appears after the month, if the month is written in full. But it's always the 24th of October or October the 24th, and then year. In American English, they start with the day very rarely. So most Americans will start with the month, then the day will go second, and then the year will follow. In forms, they usually give you hints on how exactly you need to write the date. For example, with dots or slashes. For example, 2 days of the day, 2 digits of the day, 2 digits of the month, and 2 or 4 digits of the year. So please be careful and pay attention to the hints, to the prompts. Now let's move on to question 3. And the type is different. This time you have to complete the statement. If you didn't know whether a female business person was married or not, it would be correct to use the courtesy title Ms. Now, a few words about those honorifics, or those courtesy titles, as they're called here. Now, the most common ones deal with the gender. Mr. Mr. is the title, which was abbreviated from the word Mr. You don't usually write Mr. in full, but this is the way you pronounce Mr. Mr., like Mr. Smith. And it means that the person is a man. Mrs. is pronounced Mrs. We use it for a married woman. We don't actually use the full form. Now, Miss, the full word, not abbreviated and not shortened, Miss, is used to refer to an unmarried woman. And now, obviously, you can definitely see that some sort of discrimination, like nobody cares whether a man is married or not, but like you have to identify whether a woman is married or not. Now, in the previous century, they invented the honorific title or the courtesy title, Ms. It's, again, an invented title. There is no full form. Sometimes it is quite difficult to hear this Ms. If your level of English is not high enough. But actually, this is the title which is preferred when you do not know whether a woman is married or not. You might have noticed that this is the title which I used. Again, many working women prefer to use the title MS, Ms. However, if you know for sure that a businesswoman uses the title MRS, then use it. The courtesy title will include academic titles, military titles, and probably aristocratic titles. Academic or medical titles will be the most common, especially at school or at university. Like, if you know that a person does have a scientific degree or an academic degree, then you will probably use DR or Prof. There is one important point to mention here. In American English, they usually put dots after such abbreviations. In British English, they tend to treat honorific titles or courtesy titles as separate words. This means that in a letter which is addressed to someone in Europe or in the United Kingdom, it's okay not to put a dot after MR. And this is actually what I did on the first slide. There is no dot after MS. In the United States, most writers will put a dot after MR and put a dot after MRS and a dot after Prof and a dot after Doctor and, surprisingly, a dot after Ms., which is actually not an abbreviation, just to unify the tradition. Now, military titles are less common, but still possible, depending on the type of business context you're working in, like captain, major, or general. And be very careful with aristocratic titles if you have to use them. Sir and dame are different from lord and lady. A sir is a knight, not a lord. Right? Be careful, because forms of address with the use of aristocratic titles differ a lot. And when you write or when you speak, and the diplomatic protocol is even more complicated. There are long and thick manuals which describe the process, the rules, and the traditions. If you're interested in the topic, Google. And now we're moving on to question 4. Is the statement true or false? In a business letter, dear is the standard way to greet the reader. And I will answer the question. Yes, it is. When you open a letter, you greet the reader, starting with dear someone, like dear name, dear colleagues, or dear all. The word which will follow usually starts with the capital letter. Like in the phrase dear all, you will capitalize the A. There will be alternatives, of course. For example, if the style of your letter is not formal or semi-formal, you can start your letter with hi. Now, concerning the punctuation which you use after dear, in British English, you can put a comma or you can put a colon. Most American writers prefer a comma if you are use the closed or mixed punctuation style, of course. One word of warning: don't put the exclamation mark after the salutation as we normally do in Ukrainian business writing, because this seems very, very strange. Question 5 is related to question 4. If you were writing a letter to Mr. Peter Smith, the British tradition of putting no dot after a courtesy title, you would open with, now, you know that the person is Mr., not a doctor or professor. You know his first name and you know his last name. Now, how will you start the letter? How will you open the letter? There are two possibilities, actually. You can use dear, first name, dear Peter. Alternatively, you can use dear, then the title, which is Mr., and then the last name, Smith. Starting the letter with dear Mr. Peter Smith is a mistake. Well, business associates who you know well can be addressed using their first names. But one word of warning: address a person by first name in a salutation only when you have been invited to do so. If there are several recipients of the letter, like if you are addressing a letter to John and Michael, there are 3 alternatives. For example, you can swap the names with colleagues or peers. Then you can join the names of the people with and, or you can start a separate line for each of them, like dear John, comma, next line, dear Michael, comma, and then the text of the letter. Can we move on? Question 6 then. Is the statement true or false? In the United States, it is correct to open a letter with the salutation dear sir / madam. It's wrong. Very, very wrong. It is generally believed that if you do not know the name of the person you are writing to, you will have to address your letter with dear sir or madam. Now, there are several important clarification to this particular rule. Now, let's assume that you know that the person is a man. You should open the letter with dear sir. If you know that the reader is a woman, then you start the letter with dear madam. Now, if you are addressing a letter to a company, you start it with dear sirs or dear gentlemen in the United States. Now, if you don't know how many people are going to read the letter, and if you don't know the gender of the reader or of the readers, it is sometimes appropriate to use dear sir or madam, but please don't use dear sir / madam, because this might seem extremely offensive. But people are usually very clear in identifying what gender they have. What I would advise in this particular situation, instead of using this awful and old-fashioned and outdated and offensive, as I have already mentioned, formula, sir or madam, try to be creative. You know who is going to read the letter. Well, yes, you do, because you are addressing a letter to a particular company. Then use the company name instead of sir or madam. For example, dear Microsoft, or dear Microsoft staff, or address it to a specific department and greet the staff of the department. Dear sales department, or dear sales manager, or dear admissions board, several people as the addressee, or dear recruiter, or dear hiring manager. Then obviously there is only one person there. It might seem ridiculous, but it actually works, especially in American English. If you have forgotten the name of your professor, then address the letter to dear professor. I mean, not address the letter, but greet the person as dear professor. I sometimes write circular letters addressed to all students, starting with dear students or greetings all. And this actually is totally acceptable. Let's move on to question 7 now. Now, let me read the 7th question for you. The following is an example of a block style with closed punctuation. Obviously, you have to identify whether the statement is true or false. There are 2 questions in one. One deals with the format, the block style, and the other is about the punctuation style used in this fragment, which is written in white fonts. Now, if at least one part or one half of the answer is false, then the whole statement is false. This one is false. Both questions or both answers are no. Now, this piece, this segment of a letter is most likely a receiver's address. The name of the person, then the street address, then the zip code or the postal code, and the name of the city, and finally the country. Now, it's obviously not a block, because a block is a rectangle. Well, I've never seen this type of presenting addresses in modern letters and old-fashioned letters. Now, in Ukrainian business and academic writing, we tend to use indented format. An indented format means that we have a small gap, a small space before the first sentence of a paragraph. They sometimes do it in business writing in some countries. And indentation is quite common in academic writing. And they have 2 different types of indentation there. In business writing, a block format is probably the most common nowadays. There will be 2 variations to block format, full and modified, but I won't stop on each of them at the moment. In general, a block format means that you don't indent anything on the letter except quotes, if you need them, and bulleted lists, or maybe numbered lists sometimes, just for better visualization. That is, there will be no indentation before the first line of structural blocks and the paragraphs. Then the left margin has to be justified. The right margin has to be regged. I'm absolutely sure that you know this symbol. Again, justified left margin, regged right margin. Then again, to visualize the blocks, the segments of a letter, you will have to leave one empty line between each element. I mean, not just a sentence or a line, but between the structural block and the following structural block. You also need blank lines between the paragraphs. And let me show you 2 examples. On the left, you can see a letter which is written in the block format. As you can see, The left margin is justified, the right margin is regged. Now, the only element which is written on the right is the address. This is possible even for a full block format, depending on the country. Now, the block with the sunshine flavors and with then the telephone number and the fax number is part of the letterhead. That is, you actually type in the letter on a paper with the letterhead. So this is the information which was already there when you started writing the letter. Now, in an email, it's very easy to follow the block format. Here is another example, and this time it is a report. And I took this particular text from, I think, Market Leader. And again, justified left margin, regged right margin. And there are blank lines between the paragraphs, between the blocks here, to be more specific, because there are separate sections there with subheadings. Now, it's definitely more visual. And I have to warn you that you have to watch out and be careful to leave blank lines between all paragraphs. So paragraph, blank line, paragraph, blank line. Sometimes you can leave 2 blank lines between the closing formula, like yours sincerely, and then your name. It's possible, although not many people do it nowadays. If you are writing a paper letter, then you will have to leave well, up to 4 blank lines for your handwritten signature. Now let's move on to the next question. The time has come to close the letter, and question 8 is about closing formulas. Is the statement true or false? If a letter begins with a reader's, the receiver's name, for example, dear Mr. Ross, it will close with yours faithfully. Now, wrong, absolutely wrong. It's possible to use yours faithfully when you do not know the name of the person. Like that is, if you greet the reader with dear sir or dear madam. If you use the name, then you should not use yours faithfully. The phrase yours faithfully is still used in Great Britain, and it appears in many manuals on style. In the United States, they would probably use faithfully yours, but I must admit that it's more rare nowadays than, say, sincerely yours. Another important point to make here is the order. Most Americans would start with sincerely, say, and then write yours. In the UK, it's vice versa. Yours sincerely. Now, if you know the name of the person, close your letter with yours sincerely, or simply with sincerely, especially in American English. Quite traditional, but still correct. In semi-formal writing, the variety of closing formulas won't be too great. Like, I've written several examples there, like kind regards, warm wishes, best regards, with my warmest wishes, or with my warmest regards. With several variations. Americans often choose yours truly or truly yours. Another phrase which often appears in American letters will be cordially or cordially yours. One phrase which is quite traditional in Ukrainian business writing, but very rarely appears in English business writing, is respectfully. In modern business writing, it is considered to be too old-fashioned and sometimes excessively formal. The final question of the quiz is to identify the most formal of the following four phrases. I am sending you. I'm writing to let you know that. Please accept my apology for. Can you send me some information about? Now, what you have to look at here, what you have to consider when you are identifying the level of formality is whether there are contractions in the phrase. So phrase 2 is not formal because the auxiliary is contracted there. Academic writing and formal business writing do not contract auxiliaries. You have to write everything in full. I don't mean abbreviations, contracted forms of auxiliaries, which are absolutely okay in semi-formal writing and in speaking. Now, the second thing that you will have to pay attention to is the modal verbs that are used there. Now, a question as a request, it will always be less formal than an imperative form. So please send me something will be more formal than can you send me something. Can is a little bit less formal than could. Than if we had a phrase with could there, we would probably consider it as a formal one. Now, the question is not the most formal one. Now, we have two statements left. I am sending you, and please accept my apology for. And here we come to the third thing that we will have to keep in mind. The vocabulary, which is used in the phrase. Now, I am sending you is nothing special. However, accept and apology definitely demonstrate a higher level of vocabulary and thus a higher level of formality. So I would choose please accept my apology for something. And it's correct. This was the last question on the quiz. And altogether, we've done everything that I have planned for today's webinar. So I've given you some theoretical background dealing with fundamentals of good business writing, which might be applicable to almost all document types. And we've done the quiz. Let me remind you that you can use my email if you have any questions, which are adjacent to the topic of this particular webinar. And my name was Tetiana Nyzhnyk, and I was talking on behalf of Ukrainian-American Concordia University. Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for your attention. Goodbye.